Senator Patterson.
I'll try to be very quick, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Professor McKitrick a question from the economic point of view. So we've heard that carbon is a very small factor in climate change, that the real influence is the sun and water vapor, and you talked about the danger of us muddling for another 20 years. I'd like to ask you specifically, the Government of Canada has committed to reducing Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions by 17% from 2005 levels by 2020 through a sector-by-sector approach. And I think what that is directed at is carbon dioxide. Would you say that in light of what we've heard today, which I found very compelling, would you say that this approach is misplaced and that it would be another way of muddling for another 20 years? Thank you.
Yeah, actually, even if you took the IPCC view on the effect of greenhouse gases, what the Government of Canada has proposed would have such a small effect, and even if our major trading partners agreed to the same target, this is the point that I made about the Kyoto Protocol earlier. We had enormous difficulties trying to reach that target, and yet the same models that said you've got a problem said you need something 30 times larger than Kyoto to even start showing up in the numbers in terms of actually arresting the process. There's a scale problem here. So if they're going to go, whether it's sector by sector or a carbon tax or anything like that, you're still entitled to ask, what exactly does that buy us in terms of the underlying issue? And I think if you ask that question, they would come back and say, well, it actually wouldn't change the global warming story at all, almost regardless of whose view on the science you take. And so that being the case, I would say the current technology makes it very difficult to know what to do with CO2. It's not like sulfur where you can capture it and it becomes a solid, you can dispose of it. You capture CO2, it's still a gas, you have to put it somewhere. And the scrubbers just aren't very efficient compared to particulates and sulfur. So under our current technology, I have considerable doubts they can even achieve a 17% reduction without ending up having to impose some pretty significant costs on major sectors. And if you ask what does that buy us, on anyone's view of the underlying science, it doesn't really buy you anything. So I would like to see that target debated much more robustly than it has been.
And the effort you mentioned on particulates and sulfur dioxide, which you said seemed to have been effective on the Canada's part, from your point of view as an economist, do those efforts produce economic benefits?
Back in the early 1970s, Toronto particulate levels were over 100 micrograms per cubic meter. Today they're about 30 micrograms on a bad day. Sulfur dioxide would have been about 140 parts per billion. Almost every city in Ontario now, it's between 1 and 5 parts per billion. It's not even measured in most places anymore because it's gone. In those cases, you had fairly inexpensive technologies that just pulled the stuff out of the smokestacks, and catalytic converters on automobiles get rid of about 97% of what used to be emitted in the 1960s from automobiles. So there you have low-cost technologies that actually give you a huge benefit. We're dealing with the opposite with CO2. You've got very high-cost options that give you very little benefit. And again, on anyone's view of the science, on the economic side, the numbers keep coming out really unfavorably towards these Kyoto-type or more recent efforts to impose targets. The numbers just don't add up for them.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.